The date was January 26, 1945, and the ground outside the village of Holtzwihr, France, was frozen harder than iron. It was a cold that did not merely sit upon the skin, but burrowed deep into the marrow, a malicious and biting frost that turned breath into ice crystals before it could even leave the lips. In the Colmar pocket, a stubborn bridgehead held by the Germans on the west bank of the Rhine, the winter was an enemy as formidable as the Third Reich itself. The snow was knee-deep, a pristine white blanket that concealed mine's tripwires and the frozen bodies of men who had fallen days before. For the battered remnants of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, it felt as though the entire world had been reduced to white snow-gray sky and the black, charred remains of war. They were operating at the absolute limit of human endurance, pushed beyond the point where exhaustion turns into a waking coma. Leading this company was not a towering giant of a man, nor a seasoned veteran with decades of scars and a chest full of medals from the Great War. Instead, the burden of command rested on the narrow shoulders of a 20-year-old Texan named Audie Leon Murphy. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed barely 110 pounds a frame that seemed entirely too fragile for the heavy winter coat that swallowed him whole. His face was boyish, possessed of a youthful softness that was often mistaken for that of a raw recruit fresh from boot camp. Yet behind those eyes lay the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer. Murphy was not just tired, he was dying by degrees. He was suffering from a severe bout of malaria, a lingering curse from the Mediterranean campaign. His body was racked with fever that fought a violent internal war against the freezing external temperature, leaving him trembling, not from fear, but from the violent rebellion of his own biology. He was vomiting repeatedly, his skin pale and clammy. Yet he refused to be evacuated. He knew that leaving his men now would be a death sentence for them. The situation facing Company B was beyond desperate. It was catastrophic. Weeks of brutal close quarters fighting across the frozen French countryside had whittled the unit down to a skeletal remains of its former self. Officers were dead. Sergeants were doing the jobs of captains. Privates were doing the jobs of sergeants. On the morning of January 26th, Murphy looked around the perimeter and saw only 19 men left standing out of an original roster of 128. They were hollow-eyed, their uniforms stiff with frozen mud and blood, their ammunition critically low, and their morale hanging by a thread thinner than a spiderweb. They were dug into shallow foxholes in the woods, just north of Holtzwihr, waiting for reinforcements that seemed like they would never arrive. The silence of the morning was heavy, pregnant with the threat of violence. Instead of friendly relief, the earth began to shake. It was a low, rhythmic trembling that vibrated through the frozen soil and up through the soles of the boots of the shivering Americans. It grew louder, a mechanical grinding that drowned out the wind. It was the sound of doom. Emerging from the tree line, churning the pristine snow into brown slush, came the heavy armor of the German 19th Army. 6 heavy tanks identified by the terrified infantrymen as tigers lumbered forward like prehistoric beasts made of Krupp steel. These were monsters of the battlefield, their 88mm main guns capable of obliterating anything the Americans could put in their path. Flanking them were 250 German infantrymen, elite troops, clad in winter white camouflage, moving with the disciplined precision of a wolf pack closing in on wounded prey. They moved with confidence, knowing the Americans were depleted, outgunned, and cornered. Against this armored juggernaut, Murphy had practically nothing. He had no air support as the overcast, leaden sky grounded the Allied fighter bombers that usually ruled the daylight hours. He had no heavy artillery immediately available, capable of piercing the thick frontal armor of a Tiger tank. All he had were two M10 tank destroyers attached to his unit for support. The M10 Wolverine was a specialized vehicle, essentially an open-topped turret, mounting a 3-inch gun on a Sherman chassis. It was designed to hunt tanks from ambush, using speed and maneuverability, but it was lightly armored and vulnerable in a slugging match. As the German behemoths rolled forward, their 88mm cannons roared the sound, splitting the frigid air like a thunderclap. The muzzle flashes were blinding brief miniature suns that heralded destruction. The first German shell found its mark instantly. It slammed into one of the American M10s, the impact shattering the stillness of the morning with the force of a freight train. The tank destroyer did not just break, it died screaming. The shell compromised the engine compartment and ignited the fuel stores and ammunition, sending a plume of oily black smoke billowing into the gray sky. The crew of the M10 scrambled out some of them, already burning, rolling in the snow, to extinguish the flames that clung to their uniforms. They disappeared into the woods to save their lives, leaving their vehicle behind. The M10 was now a burning coffin, immobile and screaming with the sound of twisting metal and roaring flames. The second M10 attempted to maneuver its tracks, slipping on the icy ground, as a M driver desperately tried to find a firing position. But theater of seconds, the only heavy support Audie Murphy had, was reduced to smoking scrap metal. The German infantry emboldened by the destruction of the American vehicle before they too were incinerated. In a matter of seconds, the only heavy support Audie Murphy had was reduced to smoking scrap metal. The German infantry, emboldened by the destruction of the American armor, began to advance more aggressively. Their machine guns, the terrifying MG-42s, ripped into the American lines. The distinctive sound of the MG-42, often compared to tearing linoleum, filled the air. Bullets chewed up the trees. It were razor sharps, not a request. It was a command, born of cold necessity. Get back to the woods. Get back to the state in their holes. A direct confrontation with 6 tanks and a reinforced company of infantry was not a battle. It was an execution. With a voice that cut through the din of battle, Murphy ordered his men to pull back. It was not a request. It was a command, born of cold necessity. "Get back," he screamed, waving them towards him deeper cover of that his. Pull back to the tree line. He'd safety of the tree line. Murphy remained alone at the forward command post. He was a singular solitary figure the bond between these men was forged in blood, and abandoning one of their own felt like a betrayal. Field of death. He was armed only with an M1 carbine, a weapon that was effectively a pea shooter against the armor plat. "Go!" He screamed, his breath misting in the air, his eyes blazing with a feverish intensity. As the last of his men vanished into the safety of the tree line, Murphy remained alone at the forward command post. Hing. They could see the burning wreckage of the M10s. Victory was right there waiting to be taken. They did an effective against infantry, but Weisut noticed the small figure standing his ground. They did not notice that the battle was far from over. They did not know that they had just cornered the most dangerous man in the European theater. The cold was biting harder now, or perhaps it was just the adrenaline fading into a focused, icy resolve. Murphy looked at the advancing enemy. They were confident, moving in the open, using the tanks as rolling shields. The lead Tiger tank was less than 200 yards away, its massive barrel traversing, looking for targets. Murphy knew he could not hold them off with a carbine. He needed a miracle, or he needed a weapon of mass destruction. His eyes scanned the battlefield and landed on the first burning EM-10 tank destroyer. It was a funeral pyre on tracks. The flames were licking high into the air, fed by the diesel fuel and the internal ammunition stores that were beginning to targets to obliterate. It was a ticking time bomb. Any sane man would have run as far away from that vehicle as possible. The heat radiating from it was intense enough to melt snow 10 feet away. But Audie Murphy was not thinking like a sane man. He was thinking like a tactician who had run out of options. On top of the M10 open turret mounted on a steel pintle was a specific weapon. It was an M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun. The Mowed Deuce, a weapon designed to shatter concrete tear through light vehicles and turn human beings into mist. To the smell of burning rubber oil and propellant was choking, was the only weapon on the field capable of slowing down the German infantry wave. But to get to it, Murphy would have to climb onto a burning chassis, standing on a deck that was hot enough to scorch leather directly exposed to the enemy fire, with thousands of rounds of friendly ammunition beneath his feet, waiting to explode. The sheer audacity of the idea was its only camouflage. No soldier, no matter how fanatical, would willingly climb onto a burning bomb to man a machine gun. It was suicide. It was heresy against the instinct of self-preservation. And that was exactly why Murphy moved toward it. He dropped his carbine and sprinted across the frozen ground. The snow crunched loudly under his boots. The heat from the burning tank hit him like a physical blow, a sudden and violent transition from sub-zero freezing to blast furnace intensity. He grabbed the cold steel of the tank destroyer hull, hauling himself up. The metal was slick with ice in some places and searing hot in others. Smoke choked him, filling his lungs with the acrid taste of burning rubber and oil. He scrambled up beside his small boots, finding purchase on the rivets and armor plates. As he crested the top of the vehicle, the German infantry saw him. This is where the insult occurred, a moment of hubris that would cost the German army dearly. The German soldiers advancing with their MP-40 submachine guns and Kar 98 rifles looked up and saw a diminutive figure struggling to climb atop the burning wreck. They saw a kid, a short, seemingly insignificant American, silhouetted against the flames. They did not see a threat. They saw an act of desperation, or perhaps stupidity. Officers pointed and laughed. They assumed the tank was seconds away from exploding, or that the American was trying to retrieve personal items before fleeing. They did not fire immediately. They did not scramble for cover. They continued their advance upright and arrogant, believing that the laws of physics and fear applied to everyone. They believed that no human being would stand on a burning tank to fight. They dismissed Lieutenant Audie Murphy as a non-factor. Murphy reached the turret. The heat was unbearable. The soles of his boots began to soften against the hot steel deck. He grabbed the handles of the M2 Browning. The heavy gun was cold, a stark contrast to the inferno raging beneath it. He checked the feed tray. A full belt of ammunition was loaded. He racked the charging handle, the heavy metallic clank lost in the roar of the fire. He swung the barrel around the heavy weapon, moving smoothly on its well-oiled mount. Through the smoke and the flames, he looked down the iron sights. He saw the gray forms of the German infantry clear as day against the white snow. They were close. So close he could see their faces. So close he could see the smiles on the lips of the men who thought they had already won. Murphy adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly on the burning deck, ignoring the fact that he was standing on top of a volcano. He squeezed the butterfly trigger. The .50 caliber machine gun roared to life, a rhythmic thumping bass line that drowned out the crackle of the flames. The first burst of heavy lead tore through the winter air, bridging the gap between the burning tank and the laughing Germans in a fraction of a second. The insult was answered not with words, but with a storm of copper-jacketed death. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The lead German soldiers, those who had been laughing mere seconds ago, were cut down where they stood. The .50 caliber round is a massive projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to dismember a human body, pierce light cover, and shatter bone into dust. The first rank of the German advance simply disintegrated. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by the wet thud of bodies hitting the frozen earth, and the screams of men realizing their fatal miscalculation. Murphy did not just fire blindly. He swept the gun in tight, controlled arcs, walking the fire through the enemy formation like a scythe through wheat. The snow around the Germans erupted in geysers of white powder and dirt, mixed with the red mist of casualties. The sheer violence of the assault stunned the enemy. They had expected surrender or retreat, not a buzzsaw of lead from a burning wreck. For a moment, the entire German advance stalled, paralyzed by the sudden ferocity of the resistance. But the Germans were veterans, hardened by years of war on the Eastern Front. The shock wore off, quickly replaced by a professional desire to eliminate the threat. They realized that the fire was coming from a single point, a single man, atop the burning M10. Every German weapon on the field turned towards Murphy. Bullets began to snap and hiss around him, pinging off the steel hull of the tank destroyer like hail on a tin roof. They spa front against the Russians, ainced the turret armor inches from his face. Murphy ignored them. He was in a trance state, a zone of absolute focus where fear had no place. The heat from the burning tank was intensifying beneath him. The soles of his boots were beginning to char. The smoke was getting thicker, a black, oily fog that stung his eyes and filled his throat with soot. But this smoke was also his salvation. It swirled around the turret, obscuring his silhouette, making him a phantom target that appeared and disappeared with the shifting wind. To the Germans, he was a muzzle flash in a cloud of darkness, a demon spitting fire from the center of hell. Murphy was not just fighting with the machine gun, he was fighting a multi-front war. While his right hand controlled the heavy weapon, his left hand clutched the field telephone receiver. The line was still active, connected to the artillery battalion miles behind the lines. He began to call in coordinates, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. He was calling down heavy ordnance on his own position. The artillery officers on the other end were incredulous. The coordinates Murphy gave were dangerously close, practically on top of the burning tank. But Murphy insisted. He could see the Germans trying to flank him using the drainage ditches and the tree line to get around his field of fire. He needed the artillery to smash their movements. Seconds later, the ground shook as American 105mm shells began to rain down. The explosions were deafening, throwing up massive plumes of frozen earth and shrapnel. The shockwaves rocked the burning M10, threatening to throw Murphy off his perch, but he held on, correcting his fire, directing the destruction like a conductor of an orchestra of death. The German tanks, the terrifying Tigers, were now unsure of how to proceed. They could not advance without their infantry support, which was being pinned down and slaughtered by the lone gunman. They tried to target the burning M10, but the smoke and the confusion made it difficult to get a clean shot. Moreover, they were wary of closing in, suspecting that the burning vehicle was a trap or that there were more Americans hidden in the woods. The mighty Panzer's machines that had terrorized Europe were being held at bay by a 5'5" kid with malaria and a machine gun. Murphy shifted his fire from the infantry to the tanks, raking their hulls with .50 caliber rounds. The bullets could not penetrate the thick armor, but they didn't need to. They stripped away external gear-shattered vision blocks and forced the tank commanders to button up inside their steel shells, blinding them. It was a psychological victory as much as a physical one. Murphy was making them flinch. The intensity of the battle reached a fever pitch. A squad of German infantry, realizing that a frontal assault was suicidal, crawled through a drainage ditch on Murphy's right flank. They were determined to silence the gun that was holding up their entire offensive. They moved low and fast, hidden by the contours of the land, getting within 50 yards of the burning tank. Murphy, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. He swung the heavy barrel of the Mowed around the mechanism, groaning in protest. He didn't have time to aim properly. He fired instinctively, walking the tracers into the ditch. The .50 caliber rounds tore through the brush and the dirt, finding the hidden attackers. The ambush was crushed before it could spring. Murphy turned the gun back to the main force, never stopping, never resting. His movements were mechanical, driven by a reserve of willpower that defied medical explanation. He was soaking wet, not just from the snow, but from the sweat pouring off his body inside his winter coat. The fever from the malaria was spiking his temperature, likely hovering over 104 degrees, but the fire of the battle burned hotter. Then came the moment of absolute terror. The M10 beneath him gave a violent lurch. A deep, resonant boom echoed from inside the hull. The ammunition stores for the tank destroyer's main gun were beginning to cook off. The heat had reached the shells. It was a warning shot from the vehicle itself, a signal that time had run out. The metal deck plate was now vibrating violently. Murphy knew that at any second, the entire vehicle could vaporize in a massive fireball, taking him with it. Most men would have bailed out then. He had done enough. He had bought time. He had killed dozens. But Murphy looked at the feed tray of his machine gun. There was still ammunition left. As long as there were bullets, and as long as there were Germans advancing, he wasn't leaving. He adjusted his stance on the vibrating deck, ignoring the tremors that threatened to buckle his knees. He kept firing. The Germans were now in a state of panic. They had lost the initiative. What should have been a simple mop-up operation had turned into a bloodbath. Their dead littered the field, dark shapes against the white snow. The wounded were crying out, their voices lost in the roar of the machine gun and the crashing of artillery. The American artillery, guided by Murphy's calm voice, was walking a curtain of fire closer and closer to the tank. A shell landed barely 50 yards away, the concussion nearly knocking the receiver from Murphy's hand. "Drop it 50 more," he shouted into the phone. The voice on the other end hesitated. "That's right on your position, Lieutenant." Murphy didn't blink. "I don't give a damn," he roared back. "Let 'em have it." The next volley landed so close that shrapnel pinged off the tank tracks. The shockwave blew the helmet off a German soldier crawling 30 yards away. The enemy attack was beginning to crumble. They couldn't move forward into the machine gun fire, and they couldn't retreat through the artillery barrage. They were trapped in a kill box designed and executed by one man. For nearly an hour the duel continued, one man against an army. The sky began to darken not from nightfall, but from the sheer volume of smoke hanging over the battlefield. Murphy's face was black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. His coat was singed. His hands were blistered from the heat of the gun barrel. He had fired hundreds of rounds. The belt was running dry. The clicking of the mechanism signaled the end. The gun fell silent. The sudden absence of the rhythmic thumping was deafening. Murphy pulled the trigger again. Nothing. He was out of ammunition. He threw the empty belt aside. He grabbed the field telephone one last time. "That's it," he said, his voice raspy and cracked. "I'm coming in." He dropped the receiver and prepared to dismount. His legs were stiff, his body aching in every joint. He swung himself over the side of the turret. As he did, the heat hit him with renewed force. The entire vehicle was glowing red in places. He jumped, landing awkwardly on the frozen ground. His boots, the soles half melted, skidded on the ice. He didn't look back. He simply started walking towards the woods where his men were hiding. He walked with a strange, uneven gait, the result of exhaustion and the adrenaline crash. He had made it perhaps 10 yards when the world behind him ended. The M10 finally gave up the ghost. The main ammunition magazine detonated. The explosion was cataclysmic. A ball of fire erupted outward, tearing the 30-ton vehicle apart, as if it were made of paper. The turret where Murphy had been standing seconds before was blown high into the air, spinning like a tossed coin, before crashing down into the snow. The concussion wave hit Murphy in the back, knocking him forward, but he didn't fall. He stumbled, regained his balance, and kept walking. He didn't run. He was too tired to run. He walked through the smoke, a small, limping silhouette emerging from the inferno. When he reached the tree line, his men stared at him in silence. They looked at him as if he were a ghost, a revenant returned from the land of the dead. They had watched the whole thing. They had seen the tank burning. They had heard the gun firing for an hour. They had assumed he was dead 10 times over. Some of them were crying. Others just stood there, mouths open, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Murphy didn't say a word about his own survival. He didn't boast. He didn't ask for a medic. He looked at his sergeant and said, "They're broken. Counterattack." It was an order that defied logic, but the men of Company B were no longer operating on logic. They were operating on the inspiration of witnessing the impossible. Energized by their lieutenant's survival, they surged forward from the woods. They screamed as they ran a primal release of the fear and tension that had held them captive. The Germans, already demoralized and confused, saw the Americans charging and broke. The sight of the burning tank, the devastation wrought by the single machine gun, and now the counterattack was too much. The vaunted German discipline collapsed. They retreated in disarray, leaving their wounded and their equipment behind. The Americans retook the ground, pushing the enemy back, securing the flank of the entire division. In the aftermath, the toll of Murphy's one-man stand became clear. The snowfield was a graveyard. Over 50 German soldiers lay dead, mowed down by the fire from the burning tank. Dozens more were wounded. The 6 Tiger tanks had retreated, unable to break the line held by a single 20-year-old. Murphy had single-handedly stopped a German armored offensive. He had saved his company from annihilation. He had done it while suffering from malaria, while standing on a bomb in freezing temperatures. It was a feat of arms that seemed to belong to the realm of mythology, not modern warfare. For his actions at Holzwihr Audi, Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. The citation read like a work of fiction, detailing his indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground. He became a national hero, the most decorated American soldier of World War II. His face appeared on the cover of Life magazine. He went on to become a movie star in Hollywood, playing himself in the film adaptation of his own life, To Hell and Back. He was the embodiment of the American fighting spirit, the underdog who refused to quit. But the war never truly left Audie Murphy. The ghost of Holzwihr followed him home. The boyish face that had fooled the Germans, aged prematurely, etched with the invisible lines of trauma. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that was barely understood at the time. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for the rest of his life, terrified of the nightmares that waited for him in the dark. He was plagued by insomnia, bouts of depression, and a volatile temper. The adrenaline that had saved him on the burning tank became an addiction he couldn't satisfy in civilian life. He gambled, he took risks. He sought out danger because peace felt alien to him. The man who had stood alone against a German army, who had laughed in the face of death on a frozen field in France, found that the hardest battle was the one he fought in the silence of his own mind. He had survived the abyss, the heresy, the crucible, and the slaughter, but a part of him had died on that tank destroyer in 1945. He remained a prisoner of that winter day, forever standing on the burning deck, forever pulling the trigger, forever watching the gray shapes fall in the snow. He was a hero to the world, a legend in the history books, but to himself, he was simply a soldier who had done what was necessary to keep his men alive, paying a price that no medal could ever repay.